given the end of the war, when the Nazis were losing against Russia, Hitler had a choice. Use the train cars to bring the Jews to the concentration camps and kill the Jews, or use the train cars to bring supplies to the troops in Russia. He made the choice. It's more important to kill the Jews, because if we can at least eliminate the Jews, that will be beneficial for the future, because we will have improved the race.
Greetings to the brightest audience in the country. This is Real Science Radio. I'm Fred Williams.
And I'm Doug McBurney, Bible student, science geek, amateur comedian. Fred, it is great to be back with you talking about real science on Friday.
So on today's show, we have a very special guest to discuss Darwinism, among other topics. Dr. Jerry Bergman has taught biology, genetics, chemistry, biochemistry, anthropology, geology, and microbiology at several universities for over 40 years. He has 9 degrees, including 7 graduate-level degrees. Dr. Bergman is a graduate of Medical College of Ohio, Wayne State University in Detroit, the University of Toledo, and Bowling Green State University. He has over 1,900 publications in 14 languages and 50 books and monographs, and has taught at the Medical College of Ohio, where he was a research associate in the Department of Experimental Pathology, and he has also taught at the University of Toledo and Bowling Green State University. So welcome back to Real Science Radio, Dr. Jerry Bergman.
It's great to be back again.
Hey, it's an honor, Dr. Bergman, and I think you've got almost every word with the suffix ology. I think you've got almost all of them covered.
I have taught a lot of different subjects. I get bored easily, and so I want to move on.
Well, that's awesome. Well, we'll try to keep you entertained. I believe this is either somewhere between your 5th and 8th appearance here on Real Science Radio, because you were always one of Pastor Bob's absolute favorite interviews, and we're honored to have you back.
And he always did a great job interviewing me, by the way. He was one of the best. I've done hundreds of interviews, and he was one of the best interviewers that I've had.
Yeah.
Amen.
Bob is absolutely special at that and so many other things. So Dr. Bergman, before we get started, we have a segment we call the Interesting Fact of the Week. So if you can bear with us as we challenge Doug to a fact of trivia to see how he does. And, if you want, you can take a crack at it. So, Doug, are you ready for the Interesting Fact of the Week?
That's right, Dr. Bergman. You usually get a crack at it because I usually miss. So, yeah, I'm ready, Fred. Lay it on me.
All right, so here we go. Which 2 body parts get bigger as we age? Which 2 body parts get bigger as we age?
Okay, I'm just going to go by checking my own physiology. I'm going to say it's your nose and your ears.
Oops, I hit the wrong button. Just a second.
Oh, I got it right.
You got it right, Doug.
I got it right.
Yeah,
See, that's because I'm watching my own face age in the mirror. It becomes fairly obvious.
I was going to give you a clue, Ross Perot, and that's a reference back to quite a long time ago to 1992, when he said he was all ears during a presidential debate. So, anyways, congratulations, Doug. I accidentally hit the wrong button. I'm not used to you getting the answer right.
Right, exactly.
All right.
Well, Fred, I usually don't have a subject that I can examine in order to get the answer to the interesting question of the week, but I have my own mug in the mirror, and as we get older, it just becomes more and more obvious. In fact, I think we all start to look more and more like Ross Perot the older we get, so oddly enough. But all that aside, Dr. Bergman, I want to get your opinion on this story. It's something that I only became aware of recently. And I'm just going to tell you that to me, this is shocking. And so if I shouldn't be shocked, I want to know. If I should be shocked, I want to know. If I'm misunderstanding, I want to know. I have this an article that I pulled down from progress.org. that was posted in Bio News in the month of June of this year. And the title of the article is, "Do Embryo Model and Organoid Advances Threaten Human Personhood?" And I just want to read you a quote from Dr. Insoo Hyun. He's a bioethicist from Harvard Medical School in Boston. He's published an open access paper in Cell arguing that our understanding of human personhood is not overtly threatened or destabilized by advances in stem cell-based embryo model and organoid research. Are you familiar with stem cell-based embryo models and or organoid research?
Briefly, yes. And I know we've grown organs and cells for decades. But so far, success has not been very good. And so they're trying to figure out why an organ grown in a lab doesn't tend to work as well as an organ grown in the person. And so I'm optimistic, though, that this can be done because, of course, many organs fail due to cancer or disease, and therefore organ transplants has become a very huge business, I might add, a very important business relative to money. I'll give you one brief example, which is personal. I had a hernia, inguinal hernia, which is, the doctor told me, pretty common, and I had to have it redone. And the second time it was done, it cost $50,000. I didn't pay that, the insurance did. It cost $50,000. So the two surgeries was $100,000. I could have bought a really nice car for $100,000. I mean, the best. Cadillac Escalade, I don't know, but for that. And I thought this was outpatient. I went in, they did the surgery, and I was home the same day. In fact, I was active the same day, running around the house doing different things. And so it wasn't even one day in hospital. And therefore, the expense is enormous. Now, organs is the same thing. When you have a transplant, for whatever reason, you are talking about a lot of money. And therefore, if you can grow organs from a money standpoint, the hospitals can gain a lot more than having to remove an organ from one person and transferring that into another person.
Right. Well, I can understand the business model. And in fact, I would say that if we can figure out a way to ethically grow livers and kidneys and organs, I'm for it.
Yeah, well, that's what some people are working on.
Well, but the problem with this, though, guys, looking at this science study, it's embryonic stem cells. And I know that we're going to have a problem with that, right?
Well, so this is what I wanted to get at, Dr. Bergman, and I want to know if maybe I'm misunderstanding. It seems to me, let's set the organoids aside, because I just haven't looked as much into those, but these stem cell-based embryo models appear to me to be created using embryonic stem cells that at some point, it's a tissue line at this point, but at some point those stem cells were harvested from a human being without consent, to put it mildly.
Well, there are other sources, though, of stem cells, such as the umbilical cord.
But I don't think these are mesenchymal stem cells. These are embryonic stem cells, which are not available in adult tissues.
Okay,
unless I'm wrong about that, which I'm hoping I'm wrong about.
We use HELA, Henrietta Lacks stem cells, at the medical college, and we grew millions of them. And these are found throughout the world. And of course, Henrietta Lacks died, 46, I think, or 52. So she died along very many years ago. But her stem cells tend to be very prolific and useful and healthy. Although she had cancer, she died of cancer, and that's, of course, where they got the stem cells from. But
and this was an adult This was an adult woman.
Yeah, she was around. Not sure. I would say she was pretty young to have, and I think it was uterine cancer, some type of female cancer. She was pretty young when she died. I think around 40s, 45. But her stem cells now are used. I don't know if you want to call them stem cells, but just they're cells. We just call them HELA cells, period. And they are used throughout the world with research, etc. So once you get a couple of stem cells that are as prolific as hers were, then those can be you can produce millions of them. We at the medical college, we had, I hate to count them, but we probably had millions.
So I worked at Creating BCT, and I was on a project where we actually had a incubator for adult stem cells. And from what I believe, we were the first company that was building something like this in volume, where you could get quite a few of these, because it was an expensive process back then to grow adult stem cells. It was interesting because I had asked a couple of the scientists, their opinions about evolution, because we had actual PhD scientists on our staff, and they were biologists, and they're like, yeah, I was kind of surprised they weren't really supporters of evolution. They kind of like I just kind of, they weren't pushing design, and I don't know if they were Christian, but it was just interesting that I had that exposure. And again, we, the stem cell chambers that we built were for the growth of adult stem cells. So anyways, it's kind of an interesting aside on that whole process.
A stem cell, I could mention, is a cell that has not differentiated yet. And so therefore a stem cell can become one of many other kinds of cells. So once they take the stem cell and they cause it to differentiate into a specific, like a liver cell, then of course that's the advantage of stem cells. And so there are a lot of sources of undifferentiated cells. And again, I'm surprised that Henrietta Lacks, we are able to use the cells from her, but they, for a number of reasons, they tended to be very important for medical research that we did.
Right, and so the stem cells that were derived from the adult woman, that tissue line that exists right now and has been replicated all over the world, from that line, can you grow an embryo?
I actually don't know, because, again, as you mentioned, the place where you worked, where there was PhD scientists, most PhD scientists know a lot about their area and not necessarily much about anything else. And
Sure.
Most, or many at least, are not concerned about anything else. When I worked at the medical school, we were concerned about cancer. We knew a lot about cancer cells and cancer, period, and we're not that concerned, didn't have that much knowledge about other areas of, in this case, biology, cell biology, and so on. So most scientists have to specialize before they can accomplish anything.
Of course, that the division of labor is how we've made so many technological and medical advances. So my concern in what I read from this article, first of all, my concern is these are embryonic stem cells. I don't think you can grow an embryo with an adult stem cell. I don't think that's possible. And the quotes that I read from the doctors, they're disturbing to me. So I'll just give you my suspicion, and you can tell me if maybe I need to take off my tinfoil hat. My concern is that there are medical researchers who no longer have the ethics required for ethical medical research, and that they are looking to pass off a workaround around using actual fetuses, which they have been doing. We know that they've experimented on fetuses, but they want to work around. And so my concern is now they're going to use embryonic stem cells derived from a tissue line that was sourced unethically from a murdered human being, and they're going to create embryo-like models, and I don't know enough to call them anything else. And then they're going to sell these to people as, hey, this is all ethical and there's no concern. In fact, let me read the quote from Professor Jacob Hanna at the Weizmann Institute in Israel. He gave an interview about stem cell-based embryonic models in El País, and he stated, quote, "If a fetus is controversial and I want to reach day 70, I will make no heart or frontal brain. Then it's not a fetus. It's a clump of organs. Could that be a person? No, it could never live on its own. Never forget the potential benefits. Don't only look at the potential pitfalls." Unquote. And so for me, Dr. Bergman, as just a layman, that is scary that he thinks like that. Am I paranoid?
What I find is scary is that when I was growing up, abortion was a bad term. When you
Yeah.
said so and so had an abortion, you just, oh, that's terrible. And now it's a right, it's a constitutional right, and you have people marching around basically saying, they phrase it in such a way where women's right to her own body and so on. But on the other hand, what they are really pushing pretty clearly is woman's right to have an abortion. Some states say from early stages till 9 months. Some have a line, but states, of course, have responded differently to this since the Supreme Court basically threw it back to the states. And the Planned Parenthood, et cetera, has raised a huge amount of money, which is a huge change from when you and I were young.
Sure. I think that tipping point is long past. I think that tipping point passed with, frankly, the election of Bill Clinton in 1992. Just to even say, just to elect a man who would say safe, legal, and rare meant I think we crossed that Rubicon. And I just want to remind people that while I'm not a legal expert, the Supreme Court did not throw the issue of child killing back to the states. They threw it to the states. For the first time, they codified in law that the states shall regulate the murder of innocent people. The reason Roe versus Wade happened was because states were passing laws to kill children, and there was a legitimate legal fear on the part of the child killers that the federal government was going to stop them, because it was not established that the states had the right to murder people. That was never established. Now it is. With this ruling, the Dobbs ruling establishes that for the first time in civilized Western history, that the state has the right to regulate the murder of innocent people, and it's a tragedy, and we definitely have crossed the Rubicon. And my concern with this type of research in that environment, Dr. Bergman, is that I don't trust these people to do this research ethically. And having been in medical research for many years, and having watched the sea change in the mentality of the medical community, am I just being paranoid and I should relax, or should I trust these people? I guess, in your opinion.
Well, I think probably you certainly have questions. I'm just wondering what you and I and others can do about this, because I guess I have a presentation which I give in churches on abortion, and I managed to give that presentation in 2 churches. Most are not interested.
Oh, yeah.
And I find that interesting, that if we can't get the churches on our side, how are we going to get anybody else on our side? One part of my presentation is that evolution figured quite significantly in the Roe v. Wade decision, because they were arguing indeed that based on evolutionary beliefs, which have now been, of course, shown to be false, they were arguing that indeed this is indeed just tissue, and it has the structures of primitive organisms as well, and therefore, and I don't remember all the details that they used, but a geneticist from the University of Michigan, they relied pretty heavily upon his work, and basically he said this is not a human being, has traits of an animal, it's got fish gills, etc., which you're familiar with, and therefore we're not killing a person, we're killing a fish. And it didn't put it in those terms, of course, but indeed the Supreme Court relied to some degree, some people think to a large degree, that indeed we're not killing people, we are killing animals.
Yeah. That was exactly their reasoning, and in fact that's why Blackmun wrote in the final Roe v. Wade decision that if the personhood of the fetus is ever established, the case for legalized abortion crumbles.
So many ills of society we can trace, as Jerry Bergman just alluded to evolution, the teaching of evolution. You've got this whole, they can justify abortion. They can justify racism. I mean, we've got, I'm sure Jerry's probably got a talk on racism and how that ties back to evolution. And, from this guy's quote, he said it could never live on its own. So we had a man on the street interview, and how many people, Doug, said, well, this baby can't live on its own, the fetus could never live on its own. And you brought up, what about the 1-year-old baby? It can't live on its own. What about a 2-3-year-old? They can't live on their own. Are we going to kill them too? So, and just where society's going with this, and how, the dumbing down of society. People recognize that, like, if you were to clone somebody and then you've got a living person and then you harvest their parts for the person they were cloned from, that's atrocious to them. There was actually a movie it was a science fiction movie called The Island, and it was these clones of very wealthy people, and then that they would win the lottery and get to go off the island. Well, really what it was is they were going to go be killed and their organs would be harvested for these rich people. So this isn't that far different, except it's a baby in the womb, and that they've come to where they accept it. So anyways.
Yeah, and the roots, Dr. Bergman, go right back to at least the roots of this latest manifestation of human evil, which of course goes all the way back to the 3rd chapter of Genesis. But this latest manifestation of human evil, it can really find its roots, its modern roots, in Darwinian evolution theory.
That's true, and what bothers me is that all of the major Protestant denominations and the Roman Catholic Church have officially, in writing, stated that they accept evolution as the explanation for the origin of man. And I found in visiting churches that, number one, most do not want me on to do a presentation, and the reason is because, number one, this is controversial, this issue. Number two, it doesn't matter whether we evolved, and I just was in a church in Toledo a couple of months ago, and several people said it doesn't matter whether we evolved or whether God created us. Doesn't matter. It's irrelevant. And one of the focuses of my writing is that I'm trying to document, and have been doing so for the past 30 years, the harm that evolution has done in society. And I have 12 books now in this area, several hundred articles which document the harm that evolution has done. But back to the question of evolution, my response when someone says that is, besides the harm it has done, is that the case against evolution is absolutely overwhelming. Basically, you're talking about natural selection, which no one really denies. Obviously, if you're fitter, you'll be more likely to survive. And this basis of natural selection is genetic variety. And how do you get genetic variety? Through mutations. And that's not a secret among evolutionary literature. It's very clear that mutations are the source of genetic variety, and thus the source of variety which evolution, natural selection, can select from. And since I work at the medical college in cancer research, cancer is caused by mutations. And many diseases are caused by mutations. If you think about what causes disease, it could be an inherited mutation, or it could be germs, it could be bacteria, or it could be accidents cause bodily damage. But a major cause of most diseases, or at least many diseases, is mutations. And therefore, we know a lot about mutations. I worked with them every day for a long time. We know a lot about mutations, and we know the vast majority are deleterious, or what they call near neutral. Near neutral means that they're individually not a problem, but they add up. It's kind of like a car. You have this wrong, that wrong, and eventually the car doesn't run because there's so many problems add up, and the car no longer is operational. Well, we see the same thing, mutations, basically, they add up and they cause disease, and eventually they cause death. In fact, the major cause of death really is the accumulation of mutations. Given that, how in the world could evolution ever be true if indeed it is based on the accumulation of mutations, which is not going to, in virtually all cases, improve the organism, but is going to harm it? And so if we look at the basis of evolution, it fails. And we know a lot about why mutations cause a problem, and I'll give you one brief example. When you break a bone, typically it breaks in a weak spot of the bone. And when you break your arm or break your leg, the doctor can always determine, not every single case, but can determine indeed where it broke because there are certain weak parts. Well, the same thing is true with the gene. The weak parts or the susceptible parts are more apt to change. In cancer, we know, for example, only 3 areas of the genome, and this is the P53, an important gene in cancer causation, but we know that those mutations occur 90% of the time in those 3 areas. They're called mutational hotspots. And therefore, you will never get improvement because you will constantly have mutations in those areas, constantly making changes, which we know does not improve it. We know what happens is it breaks the gene. The gene doesn't do the job it's supposed to. and therefore you end up with cancer. And so we know a great deal, a huge amount, about mutations because, well, that's what we did at the medical school because that's what causes cancer. So you can't deal with cancer until you understand what genes mutate, where they on the gene mutate, etc. And so if you think about it, it's really ludicrous. You're saying to me that we evolved by the accumulation of mutations, which we know are in the vast majority of cases deleterious or near neutral. Therefore, how in the world could evolution be true? It's not only not true, but if you think about it, it's silly. It's not responsible. Intelligent people, you should not accept it. And of course, the reason they do is because that's all they hear in school. Or that's generally all they hear in school.
Yeah, I was going to say that, one of the slides I use in one of my presentations comes from data I got from you, Dr. Bergman. I can't remember if it was a book or paper, but you had something on the literature, the secular peer-reviewed literature, and you did a search for beneficial mutation hits.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and we're showing it on the screen now, but for the listening audience, I'll read those. So you found 453,732 mutation hits. Out of that large number, almost 500,000, you found only 186 that were listed as, quote, beneficial. And of these 186, when they were examined closely, they actually resulted in the loss of some function. So they were loss of information. So even the ones listed as beneficial, you did not gain information.
Right, and beneficial usually for us, one of the examples I gave was seedless fruit. Well, they're not beneficial for the fruit, obviously, because that's the end of its genetic line. But they are beneficial for us because when you eat your watermelon or eat your grapefruit, you don't have to worry about spitting out seeds. I find this is frustrating because we're not talking about rocket science in any way, shape, or form. We're talking about, and the debate has been, the true model approach. We teach creation or evolution, a true model approach. I think that's a waste of time. What we need to do is show why evolution is not true. Clearly, the science is behind why it is not true and the harm that evolution has caused. And indeed, in our society, can we, with this knowledge, ensure that such fiasco does not happen again? So it's not a matter of one model versus another model. It's a matter of one idea, evolution, doesn't work because of the accumulation of mutations. And again, in the area I worked, that we all agree. I mean, if I would say, well, gee, these mutations would cause cancer, maybe they'll be beneficial and maybe we can get an improved human being. I'm sure they have looked at me and said, are you all right, Bergman? You need some sleep. Are you on something? Because we know that mutations cause harm, period. When I give my presentation, every now and then I have some doctors in the audience, and I typically ask them, or some nurses, or radiologists, and I ask them, indeed, do you think we can get beneficial results from mutations? And they say, well, of course not. It's obvious. When you do an x-ray on a patient, you protect, especially the gonads, or if a woman's pregnant, you have to be careful because you know that the radiation causes mutations, which you know in the vast majority of cases they are harmful. And therefore, to me, for people to say, well, I believe in evolution, as this one teacher did at the church I was at in Toledo, how in the world can you teach science and actually believe that indeed mistakes, damage to the genome can ever produce anything good? Now, I'm not saying it's 0%, but it's very close to 0%. Every now and then you'll have a mutation which indeed does produce something beneficial, but they're so rare. I've looked for a good example and I have yet to find one.
Well, Dr. Bergman, that actually brings to mind a question I've had, especially recently as we have focused on the evolution, so to speak, of this one particular virus that was discovered in 2019, and we've been watching it, and the news media has been announcing the new variants every now and again, and they say that the virus continues to mutate. And the question that brings to my mind is, because of the evolutionary worldview inculcated into the medical research community, is it possible that they are calling adaptations mutations? Is that possible?
Okay, what they are doing, they use the term mutate, but many organisms, especially viruses, have a system which basically the genes change parts, but it's a design system. It's like my computer. My computer can produce all kinds of things depending upon what information I put into it. But on the other hand, the computer can be designed in such a way to where it will add information or subtract information or change information. And it's a good example of spell check. I use computers, as you do, and when I type a word in that's not spelled right, basically the program it's designed to correct the spelling, so it's the right spelling. But every now and then it changes the spelling, so it is correct spelling, but it's not the word that I'm thinking about. It's some other word. And so in the end, the intelligence of the person has to deal with that. Well, we know viruses and bacteria as well. They have a way of basically changing automatically genes. It's not done by pure chance. They change the genetic code, and some changes can be beneficial, other changes cannot. But we're not talking about random mutations caused by some problem. We're looking at the changes are made according to a systematic way. It's almost like they try A, it doesn't work. They try B, it doesn't work. Try C, and it works. And therefore that virus produces like crazy, and therefore that virus becomes more common. And so we've known that for many years. It's not anything new. And a lot of people, we use the word mutation, but it's really not a mutation in the sense that we're using.
Right, right. And Dr. Bergman, since I have your ear, I have to ask you this question. I've long suspected that the people selling research to the government, claiming that they can make viruses do this or that, or they can make this virus more lethal, I suspect that they can't really do what they're claiming they can do, and that they're making an awful lot of money bamboozling an awful lot of people. Not that what they're doing can't be harmful, but this idea that you can genetically manipulate a virus to make it more lethal easily, I don't buy that. What do you think?
I don't know about easily, but I know that viruses can be manipulated, and that's called gain of function, and that is research that I did as well at the medical school, gain of function. Now, why would we do that? We'd use gain of function because we're trying to understand some aspect of the genome, and therefore there are systems that are well recognized. Lambda virus is the one we use because it's large, has plenty of stuff you can take out, and it still functions as a virus. So lambda virus, in fact, I think that's the main one we used. Most of the research was done with lambda virus. And basically, it's gain of function. You pull genes out, you put genes in, and then you infect an organism with those new genes. And then we did research to determine how it changed the organism and what effect it had. And so therefore, gain of function is pretty basic. They talk about it in the news like it's something new and so on. And I'm sure there are millions of people out there doing gain of function research. It's such a common research technology that you can just order from the catalog what you're looking for. So you take a catalog, you go through there, and you're looking for this particular gene, and you order the gene. They sequence the gene, they send it to you, and then you can put that gene inside of the lambda virus, is the one that we use. And therefore, you can learn a great deal about how the organism works by this tinkering. And that's to some degree what we're doing is tinkering and trying to find out indeed how these microorganisms, or in this case viruses, work.
Okay, and so a researcher like yourself, naturally regulated by the fear of God, I would trust you with that kind of research. Guys like Peter Daszak, who claim they can make a cold virus more lethal, I don't believe him, number one. Number two, if it can be done, it's not easy, and I just don't trust them.
What they were trying to do in China was to produce a more lethal virus and then learn how to treat it. It's like eventually this virus will mutate in this way to cause a disease. Well, why don't we mutate it in that way? Why don't we make a virus which is problematic and then learn how to treat it? It's what we did at the medical school. You can't do research on cancer until you have an organism that has cancer. And so we use mice often, other organisms as well, and we caused the mutation by an NNK, and it's a long word, so we just said NNK. We take NNK, and that invariably causes cancer. So we deliberately cause cancer in the organism to then understand how it can be treated or dealt with, or understand in more detail how to respond to the cancer that we cause. But we can't do research on cancer until we have organisms that have cancer. So we had to learn to give cancer to the organism so we could do the research. And I suspect this is the same thing you find in China, what they were doing. What bothers me is that they kept saying things that were just obviously not true, like it was a natural change that occurred in the wild, and they ended up from the wild bat or whatever infecting a person, and then it spread from that person to many other people and so on. And it's highly likely to have been changed in the lab. The problem was it got out.
Yeah.
So that was a gain of function. That you believe that was a gain of function from the lab in China?
Oh yeah, I think that's pretty obvious. That unless I have evidence otherwise, but that's pretty clear.
So I think what we're going to find out is that the layers of bamboozlement are onion-esque when it comes to unraveling exactly what happened there. What I don't believe is that Peter Daszak and his crew, I don't believe they know how to make a virus more lethal easily. And that's why they've been bilking the government out of billions and billions of dollars for decades, doing what he claims can be done easily. Well, if it can be done so easily, Pete, why have you been doing it for 10 years and you've taken in billions and billions of dollars? It's not as easy as they say. It is dangerous, very dangerous. I think even, would you agree with me, Dr. Bergman, that even harvesting these viruses from way down in the bat caves, or they're going after getting viruses that are highly unlikely to get out in the environment. They're going and taking them out and putting them. To me, that's dangerous, and I would have to have someone. I don't know who I would trust with that. What do you think?
Well, I agree. We were not concerned about causing viruses to be more dangerous. We were concerned about causing cancer so we could treat it, and so that was the focus in our area. But on the other hand, I don't know whether you can weaponize viruses. I imagine some people claim they can do it. But certainly you're correct about the billions of dollars that they have in some ways bulked out of the population, produce all kinds of research, probably 90% of it, which isn't helpful. But then they can argue, 90% is not helpful, but 10% is. And so we're looking for the 10% that we can deal with helping whatever by this 10%. So, but you're right, a lot of money, billions of dollars are spent funding research, which a lot of it's not fruitful. It's never going to go anywhere. But on the other hand, you have to gamble, I guess.
Well, Pastor Bob had an axiom that in the long arc of history, when we have an opportunity to look back, the retardation of science that has occurred since the adoption of the Darwinian evolution model will be revealed to be just catastrophic. The catastrophic retardation of scientific progress. What do you think?
Oh, I agree fully, and that's why we need to be aggressive in opposing this science, so-called science. And what frustrates me is, because I know I'm not going to get into the universities and present this information. They're not interested, by and large. And the mindset is such where they're not in our side. What frustrates me is trying to get into the churches. And although I don't mean to be too negative, because I've been at about 400 different churches. So it's not like the door is closed, but on the other hand, the door is not open, because around where I live, within, say, 80 miles from around where I live, not one single church has invited me. And I wonder why. What's going on? And I've talked to many pastors, and they say, well, number one, this is not important. Number two, it's controversial. And it's, as I mentioned before, it's not controversial. Because I have yet, of the 400 churches I presented this information to, I have yet to have a single person in any of the churches say, wait a minute, Dr. Bergman, I disagree with you. In fact, I wish that would happen occasionally, because it could produce some dialogue which could be very beneficial for me, for the church, and for the person. Actually, once I did in a large Methodist church. And they warned me this person was a lawyer, he was a bright person, and he's going to challenge you after the presentation. So he came up, and right away I could tell, because he was pretty knowledgeable about this issue. I could tell he was a lawyer, bright fella. And we had, I must admit, one of the best discussions I've ever had, any church in any part of the world. We had a great discussion. Matter of fact, my motel was nearby, and I was trying to leave the church at like 8:30 or something like 9 o'clock, and then go to my motel. We were there probably close to midnight talking. And he says, I really enjoyed talking to you. I had a very wrong impression of creationists. of what they believe, where they're coming from. Very wrong idea. And I knew it was late because the parking lot was full when I went to the church. But when we left, there was 2 cars in the parking lot, mine and his. And it was totally empty, aside from us two. So I can't say there was not any controversy, but there was once out of 400 churches.
Well,
and it sounds like he came around to your viewpoint, or at least was heading that direction, right?
Yeah, he understood where I was coming from, and he realized relative to the whole evolution issue, there's no way you're going to evolve organisms by producing damage to the genome. It's not going to happen.
It's good to hear that he was willing to ask you questions, because I heard a rumor, Dr. Bergman, and you can confirm or deny it. It seems like somebody told me that Richard Dawkins was supposed to have a debate with you, and it was all set up, and then he found out it was you and backed out. Is that?
Yeah.
Did I hear that correctly?
Yeah, that's right. I was looking forward to it, and I was kind of hesitant at first, but then I come up with a presentation which I thought was pretty effective, and I worked on this for several months, and he wanted my resume, and so I sent my resume to Indianapolis, and they, of course, had contact with him, and they sent it on to him, and he sent an email to Indianapolis and said, I'm not debating him. So I was disappointed, but what do you do?
Well, that's just, you put that feather in your cap. That's all you can do. That's wow.
But I would have loved to debate it. I would love to debate anyone. I'm thinking if we could raise $10,000 and give it to a scientist, say, if you debate so-and-so, here's $10,000, debate him, that's all you have to do. And even that is going to be hard to find scientists or others that debate us.
Oh, yeah.
But on the other hand, I've been in 3 debates in my career. And one thing you have is a huge audience. And invariably, they recognize that we're not a bunch of lunatics with touting the Bible, and our beliefs did not come totally from Genesis, that we're looking at science.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And indeed, from a scientific standpoint, we've got the argument. And therefore, especially the one debate I had with a professor from Michigan, and he, towards the end of the debate, he was almost on my side. And just really being nice to me. He said, here, let me carry your equipment out, and let me do this. And I'm going to tell you, really accommodating. He enjoyed the debate, and he enjoyed getting to know me. And he was a PhD biologist professor, and he was very impressed with my arguments. One problem you do have in churches is that you're over the head of 80% of the congregation.
Well, wait a second there, Dr. Bergman, because what you just said, the 2 scenarios that you just described are the problem with the church. So this isn't a scientifically controversial issue. This is a spiritually controversial issue. The 2 scenarios you just described prove that when this topic is put in front of the lost, I'm talking about hell-bound sinners, they're open to reason, and you can even make inroads with them. What the pastors seem terrified of is offending the people in their church who claim to be Christians.
They are really, and from our standpoint, of course, we've seen the other side. We're aware of the other side. But from my work with pastors, they're not aware of the other side. And they really believe that evolution has been documented 100%, period. They really believe it's true. And therefore, what we have to do is we have to understand Genesis in light of the fact of human evolution. And invariably, I've been involved in directly or indirectly in about 200 court cases. And invariably, when they go to court, some creationist is let go from teaching because he questioned the fact of evolution, they say. And invariably, you have a Methodist or Lutheran pastor who testifies that why we have no problem with evolution, why I teach at a large Methodist college, and all the entire faculty accept the fact of evolution. And therefore, we don't want to be another Galileo again. We don't want to make another mistake opposing science. We have to accept science because it's been overwhelmingly proven over and over again. We have all this evidence. We have all these vestigial organs which have no function, which proves, of course, evolution.
Oh.
They'll give you all these reasons, and over and over again, it gets frustrating because you can't. I would love to. In fact, we've tried this in the past, inviting 10 pastors to hear my presentation, and they're not interested. They're not, although in Chicago we had like 12, 14 pastors heard my presentation. They were very, very receptive, very supportive. But my thought is that probably they were supportive anyways, or at least a number of them were. Stem cell research you were talking about. We could just reach the churches. We could do a great deal of good. And my primary argument is that people say, well, the churches can't do anything. Well, I spent a lot of time in black churches, and the fact is black churches have changed radically the world. The whole civil rights movement was born, festered, supported, incubated in the churches. And if you do any reading about the civil rights movement, if you watch any films about the civil rights movement, the churches were central. In fact, they rarely met anywhere else to do the civil rights meeting. The black church changed the world, and we see that Martin Luther King, for example, I'm a stamp collector, and I'm amazed at how many stamps throughout the world feature Martin Luther King. And countries aren't going to feature Martin Luther King unless they have a lot of respect for him, and that's obviously the case. Even communist countries glorified Martin Luther King. And so he has changed not just the United States, and if you've been around as I have, the black church changed the United States. It also changed the world. And so we can change the world. Jesus did it. We've got the facts. We just have to get out there in the churches, and we can change the world through the churches. That should be our main door. And that way, when these cases end up before a court, you don't have a Methodist or Lutheran or Episcopalian pastor say, why, we have no problem with evolution. It's fine. We accept that's God's means of creation.
Wow. Yeah, I agree 100%. I mean, the churches have been a huge part of the problem. And we find that in our local creation group. And I've tried to give a talk. I was all set to give a talk to a large crowd of at least 1,000 people, a really big church in Denver. And I made the mistake of, they asked for my presentation. They asked me for the PowerPoint. I'll never do that again. I sent it to them. I should have said, well, no, I prefer to, here's generally what I'm talking about. And them just looking at my presentation, somebody nixed the deal. It was, we were like a week away from giving the presentation. So the churches are a huge part of the problem. And yeah, you're 100% right, Dr. Bergman. We got to get the churches involved somehow. So do you have a strategy for that? Do you have some thoughts on how we can make some inroads there?
Well, I find we did this in Seattle, the scientist out there has been working in this area for 20 years. And he found the first 4 or 5 years, just doors slammed over and over and over. But once he got into one church, and they found the presentation was helpful, useful, etc., then that pastor would say, hey, we had so-and-so, this creationist, come in my church and gave a presentation last month. He did a good job. I enjoyed it. Oh, really? Who was he? Oh, his name is Heinz, so-and-so, and here's his phone number. And so when I went there a couple months ago in Seattle, I went, I think, probably 8 churches. I was there like 7 days. Many churches. I went morning service, evening service. And one church I went to was a Thursday service. And I said, you have service on Thursday? Well, no, we never do. But since you couldn't make it for Wednesday or Friday, we got you in for Thursday. So they said, now there may not be many here. There may be 5 or 6 or 10 or 20. And I said, well, okay, that's fine. And so when I was there on Thursday night now, we had 180 or so. And it surprised the pastor that there were many there on an extra night. And so once the word gets out, we tend to do pretty well. But the key is one church has to open the door. And once they do, hopefully, then other churches can. So I think we really need to focus on churches.
Amen. Dr. Bergman, in my Christian life, I have found creationist arguments to be among the most effective arguments for causing the lost to consider themselves, their sin, forgiveness from Jesus Christ. It's been one of the greatest door openers. So why do we need to change the world? A lot of Christians, they rightly say, hey, we're not here to reform the world, we're here to save the lost. Well, one of the ways we save the lost is by impacting the world, because we have to get the attention of the lost in order to witness to them that they're sinners and that they need forgiveness. And so our obligation is to impact the world. Maybe we're not going to reform the world, maybe we're not going to save the world, but we have to make some noise in the world. And Dr. Bergman, just appreciate what you've been doing for so long in promulgating one of the most effective evangelical messages in evangelism.
You sound like you read my book called Darwinism is the Doorway to Atheism, where I have a 400 and some page book of cases of, and some of these were seminary students who were working their way to become a pastor and were introduced to Darwinism, accepted it, and now are atheists or at least agnostics. And of course, Michael Shermer's the most famous example of that. He was a devout Christian, or he claimed to be. And when people talk about his born-again experience, he said that was not false. I really had that experience. I can tell you what church it was, what pew it was, where I was when I had that experience. But you're an atheist now. Well, that's true. I am, because the facts don't go along with. But he does not negate his born-again experience.
You've presented pretty good evidence that the church is a mess, that the church has been successfully bamboozled into believing that this is science. I want to quote 1 Kings chapter 14, verse 16, where the prophet is speaking to the children of Israel and he's warning them. And in 1 Kings 14:16, he says, "And he, God, shall give Israel up because of the sins of Jeroboam, who did sin and who made Israel to sin." And so Pastor Bob used to say, well, no one can make you sin. We all sin on our own, right? But what does this mean then if this is in the Bible? Well, what Jeroboam did through his wickedness and his rebellion is similar to what the educational institutions and now the churches and the government have done, in that they've created an environment in which the average person participates, even ignorantly, in sinful behavior, promulgating Darwinism, taking advantage of unethical medical research going on with people who are harvesting the body parts of people who were murdered. So this environment that has been established that causes people to participate in sinful behavior, it's not something that God's going to hold any one individual person accountable for as their sin, but it's the overall environment that causes people to go to hell in massive numbers. Not to put too fine a point on it, but that's the environment that they're in, that we are in today, and that's why we appreciate your voice, Dr. Bergman, out there speaking for the truth from the science and from the Bible.
I'm working at it. By the way, another book I wrote is Science is the Doorway to Theism, or Christianity. These people were atheists, 50 cases. People were atheists, and they became Christians specifically by studying science. And there's a number of well-known scientists in that book. And so I'd like to get that out more, to a wider audience, but because it's readable, because it's talking about cases, people's lives.
Amen.
And so it's not scientific books so much. It's basically books about people's lives and why they made the decisions they did.
So what is your latest book, Dr. Bergman, and do you have one in the works?
I have several in the works. The problem is, though, I'm competing with Answers in Genesis. Master Books publishes their books. First edition, they'll print maybe 10,000 copies, and then the Creation Museum and the Ark will sell within a couple of months 10,000 copies. So they'll have another printing, 10,000 more copies. Well, my Master Books published 3 of my books, and the problem is they have, again, about 5,000 copies, the first edition, and 5 years later they still have a few left. So just a money standpoint purely, if you have a chance of publishing a book by Bergman or by Answers in Genesis, obviously if you want to pay your bills, you're going to make a lot more money if you go, and you're going to survive, pay your bills, if you sell to Answers in Genesis. So part of the problem is I sell fairly well when I'm on my ministry. But on the other hand, I don't have a creation organization like Answers in Genesis. I don't send newsletters out every month as they do. I don't have a museum that costs $50 million. And so therefore, I do pretty well considering. But on the other hand, I have at least 3 books that are in the works, which the publishers have agreed to publish. But on the other hand, they're not making money.
And we all have to make money. Everybody's got to eat. Somebody's got to fix the plumbing and all that. Maybe Answers in Genesis could be could be persuaded to carry and promote your books based on the quality of the material?
Well, they could, and I need to contact them again. They do carry some of them. In fact, originally they carried all my books. So for 20 years ago, when they first opened, they carried all my books. But then my books, if they compete with their books,
right.
Yeah.
And so instead of basing their decision to market on the best quality information, it's become more about money, which is kind of the nature of human institutions, right? That's kind of the way.
Well, they have a lot of people employed. They have a lot, dentists and dentists. I mean, they have to raise the money to do what they've done.
Yeah.
In fact, it's quite amazing they've been able to do what they've done with their support. But on the other hand, I'm just kind of a lone guy out there.
Well, I'll tell you what, Dr. Bergman, I don't want to put too fine a point on this, but when you as an institution when you get to the point where you have to raise the money to do what you do, you should consider disbanding your organization. That's my advice to anyone who starts an organization. When you're making decisions based upon, I need the money to do this because I'm this big, it might be time for you to just step aside and let someone else in.
Well, I don't really have an organization. That's
my advice to all organizations across the board. Harvard being my number one example of what happens if you hang around too long.
I guess I do what I can, and I was in a church in Toledo, actually about a month ago.
Praise the Lord.
And at least two people come up to me and say, your books have changed my life.
Amen.
Very important in my walk. And therefore, they're not common, but they're not rare. And so therefore, you're rewarded for what you're doing when you realize that indeed your writing has changed people's lives. And it's surprising because this church I was never at before. But people knew my work, they knew my writing. And by the way, I did really well in selling books there. And they welcomed that because that gave their congregation an opportunity to pick up books that they normally could not pick up. And therefore, it's very rewarding. But that's unusual because so many churches, they're not aware of this. They're not aware of the other side, and they're not. The main thing is they're not aware of the importance.
Do you have a website, Dr. Bergman, that we could share with our audience so that they could get some of your materials?
crev.info, which is where I post my stuff on. Where can you purchase my material? Amazon, online. You can get on Walmart, Kmart, and the other stores, and you can buy my stuff. So the main source is through Amazon. All my books are available on Amazon. Or if you look at addall.com, ADDALL.com, they sell used books. And there's probably, 500 of my books on that website. And so you can buy a book for a lot less money.
Is there 3 books that you could recommend to start off with? Because if, they may not know which book to pick to start because there's so many good ones. And I'm just wondering if we could maybe give our audience a list of 3 to start with. Maybe not necessarily in any order, but.
I can email a list. One thing I do is that I write books nobody else has written. For example, I have a book on Dwight Eisenhower. Now, why would a creationist write a book on Dwight Eisenhower? Well, you may not be aware of this, but World War II was a war between creation and evolution. And fortunately, creation won. Because if evolution would have won, most of you would be speaking German because they would have won the war, etc. And so Eisenhower made that very clear. He made it very clear what his goal was, what his purpose was. And I have a 300 and some odd page book documenting indeed that was a war between creation and evolution. And creation fortunately won. And we know that Eisenhower was exposed to creation when he was really young because we know the books that he had in his house. And he had indeed several books on creation. And we also know that he supported the creation worldview. And one thing he was concerned about was, of course, the Nazis. The key behind Nazism was evolution. Some races were more evolved than others. And that was a key to World War II. And I mentioned this somewhat in this book, but I have another book which goes into more detail in this. In that, given the end of the war, when the Nazis were losing against Russia, Hitler had a choice. Use the train cars to bring the Jews to the concentration camps and kill the Jews, or use the train cars to bring supplies to the troops in Russia. He made the choice. It's more important to kill the Jews because if we can at least eliminate the Jews, that will be beneficial for the future because we will have improved the race. the race will be better because of elimination of the Jews. So given a choice between winning the war and killing the Jews, he chose, clearly, dealing with the Jews.
Wow.
Wow. That's wow.
And this is
Okay. So, Dr. Bergman, sign me up. There's your first recommendation. That's the first book of yours that I'm going to buy as soon as we get off the air.
Okay.
Sign me
Agreed.
up. I'm getting it. That's number one. Do you have two more that you'd recommend?
Okay, another book I've written is on the Scopes trial. And invariably in the Scopes trial, they talk about science versus religion. And I have dozens of books on the Scopes trial, well, more than a dozen, probably 100. And they basically, the theme is science versus religion. The ironic factor is all of science that they brought up at the Scopes trial, every one of it has been clearly disproven now, like Piltdown Man, like Java Man, like Neanderthal Man, etc. So the evidence they have now is clearly shown to be wrong. And Bryant's main concern was racism. And racism was clearly an important part of the book in the Scopes monkey trial. Namely, of course, the book, the civic biology, called Civic Biology by William Hunter. And so civic biology is clearly, openly, blatantly racist, especially against blacks. And ironically, people are surprised when I bring this up about our friend William Jennings Bryan, that in 1902 he was writing long articles, which basically he's concerned about equality of the Negroes and equal rights, equal education, equal this, equal that. And he was really, in 1902, he was 50 years ahead of the Civil Rights Movement. And the Civil Rights Movement was working for the same things that Bryan was pushing. And so Bryan was clearly concerned about the racism taught by evolution, and therefore he was clearly concerned not to be able to present these racist ideas in classrooms. And that's just totally ignored by so many people, even though it's very clear. I have a whole book which deals with that. It's the only book, by the way, that deals with the Scopes trial and how at the core of it was racism. And if you read the Hunter textbook, which they used at the school at that time, boy, I mean, it's blatantly, openly racist. There's a whole chapter in there which is racist as in eugenics as can be written. And so those are two books alone. And of course, the other book I mentioned, Darwin's The Doorway to Atheism, and Science, The Doorway to Theism. I have another book which I can't remember I come up with the title, and I think it's a good title, and the publisher change it. I can't remember the titles of my own book, which I guess I don't need to know that. That's not. But I have several books that talk about the harm that Darwinism has done, and I talk about the fact that when it was discovered that X-rays cause mutation, the man who discovered this got a Nobel Prize because he learned how to speed up evolution. You speed up evolution by taking these young girls who are pregnant, putting them under an X-ray machine, and bombarding their body with X radiation. And that's really what he said. We can speed up evolution by increasing the mutation rate, by exposing people to X radiation. And he got a Nobel Prize for that, and they made that very clear.
Scary.
That was why he got the Nobel Prize. There's an article in Scientific American which basically says man discovered a way of speeding up evolution.
Wow.
And
okay, so Dr. Bergman, Fred and I have been in the evolution creation battle for 20 or 25 or 30 years combined. You're telling us stuff we've never heard. You write the books that nobody else has written. William Jennings Bryan, Dwight Eisenhower. I mean, you got me now. I'm in. Yeah. And then I'll add the harm book. Just praise the Lord. It's such an honor to be able to talk with you, Dr. Bergman, and just wish the blessings of the Lord on all your efforts out there. Just been amazing. Thank you.
You should bring me out to your city. I've been out there, 4 times now?
Oh, I guarantee you I have a church I'm going to invite you to.
Okay.
Yeah, same here. Doug's in San Diego. I'm in Denver, Dr. Bergman. So I'm going to talk to our local creation group and get you out here. That would be fantastic.
That would be good, yeah.
Amen.
I usually have good crowds a lot of people know my work, and therefore I usually have good support.
Yeah. Amen. And, we just got to recognize it's a huge spiritual battle. I mean, you talked about, the Scopes trial and William Jennings Bryan. Dr. Carl Werner brought up the part about the point that Nebraska Man, which was a fraud, they hoisted that into William Jennings Bryan's writings against evolution, because William Jennings Bryan lived in Nebraska. And so people go back and watch that video with Carl Werner, but so much of this stuff, it's a spiritual warfare. So much damage is being done by the church by letting this whole lie of evolution continue to spread. So we just got to keep fighting the good fight, Dr. Bergman and Doug. And I wanted to close the show with a verse that popped onto my phone. And I think you'll like this, Dr. Bergman, because I'm going to say that I thought of you, because you were coming up on the show. I know of the great work you've done, all the the PhDs you've earned and that help us really promote creation from a really impressive scientist. And this is from 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 58, the closing verse of this important chapter. And it's, "Therefore, my beloved brethren, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that your labor is not in vain in the Lord." So, Dr. Bergman, we greatly appreciate the work you're doing. Do you have any last thoughts or comments for our audience?
It's good to be on, and I think Bob would be happy with the work that you guys are doing.
Oh,
and I know he would be. So,
thank you, Dr. Bergman. It's been a blessing.
And by the way, Dr. Bergman, Bob's last appearance was in near San Antonio, Texas, and I joined him at an ex-Jehovah's Witness conference, because a lot of those folks are, being, they're being persuaded to become atheists. These atheists, they're welcoming them with open arms, and so Perry Little's thrown on a couple of conferences down in Texas, and I know they've got conferences across the country for ex-Jehovah's Witnesses. And so that was Bob's last presentation, was to ex-Jehovah's Witness. And from what I understand, you're ex-JW.
Yeah, 50 years ago, but it was quite a bit younger. I was involved.
So that was August before he ended up getting the COVID. So anyways, again, such an honor having you on. I'm sure we'll definitely have you on again.
Amen.
We'd have you on about every week if we had a show for every new book you write or new paper you put out.
Well, I could talk about my books, and I'll send you a list of my books, and that way you'll know the titles. The titles are pretty obvious. What's but
fantastic,
my focus.
Fantastic, Dr. Bergman. We look forward to it. God bless you, brother.
Okay, thank you much. Great to be here.
Thank you, Dr. Bergman. So for Dr. Jerry Bergman and my co-host Doug McBurney, I'm Fred Williams of Real Science Radio. May God bless you.